There are cases the FBI solves in days. There are cases that take years. And then there are cases that take 50 years, consume thousands of investigators, generate more theories than answers, and still end with nothing. No arrest, no confession, no name. Just a man in a suit, a briefcase, and $200,000 that vanished into a storm. If you've never heard the full story of D.B. Cooper, the only unsolved air piracy case in American history, you're about to. And if you have heard it, I promise you, not like this. Stay with me. This one gets deep. And if you're new here, this channel covers the true crime cases that the headlines forgot. If that sounds like your kind of thing, hit subscribe. It takes 2 seconds, and it means the world. The rain came down sideways that evening. November 24th, 1971, Portland International Airport. The kind of night where people keep their heads low and move fast through the terminal, collars turned up, eyes on the floor. Nobody wanted to be outside. Nobody wanted to linger. Nobody except him. He walked in through the main entrance at a pace that was almost unhurried. A middle-aged man, medium build, dark suit, neatly pressed, tie clipped close to his collar, a briefcase held loosely in one hand, like a man who had been carrying briefcases his whole life and never thought twice about it. He wore dark sunglasses, even in the gray, rain-soaked terminal, and no one seemed to notice or care. He approached the Northwest Orient ticket counter and paid cash, one-way ticket to Seattle, flight 305. He gave his name as Dan Cooper. The agent handed over his boarding pass without looking up. He folded it once, placed it inside his jacket pocket, and turned toward the gate. No checked luggage, no carry-on except the briefcase, no one meeting him, no one to see him off. He sat in the gate area and waited with his hands resting flat on his knees, watching the rain streak down the terminal windows, perfectly still. There was nothing about him that would make you look twice. That was the point. Nobody standing in that terminal on that rainy Wednesday evening had any idea they were watching a man who was about to pull off one of the most audacious crimes in American history, a man who would spend the next 5 decades haunting the FBI, a man's whose real name, to this day, no one knows. He boarded the plane quietly, took his seat near the rear, and ordered a bourbon and soda. Then he reached into his jacket, removed a folded note, and placed it on the tray table. He waited. Florence Schaffner was working the aisle when she noticed him, seat 18E, window seat. He caught her eye as she passed and slid the note across the tray table without a word.
She assumed he was flirting. It happened. Men on business flights sometimes tried it with the attendants, slipped notes, left phone numbers, tried to be charming in that particular way that was neither charming nor clever. She tucked the note into her uniform pocket without opening it and kept walking. The man waited until she came back down the aisle. "Miss." His voice was quiet, steady, no edge in it. She stopped. He looked at her. "You should read that note." Something in the way he said it made her pause. Not the words themselves, but the calm behind them, the certainty. Like a man who already knew exactly how the next hour was going to unfold and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. She pulled the note from her pocket. "I have a bomb. Come sit next to me." The letters were neat, printed in ballpoint pen. Florence kept her face still. Years of professional training, the kind of composure flight attendants develop from 1,000 turbulent flights and difficult passengers, kicked in. She folded the note, slid into the seat beside him, and spoke quietly. "Is this real?" He set the briefcase on his lap and opened it just enough. She looked inside. Later, she would describe what she saw as wires, a battery, and red cylindrical objects. Whether it was a genuine explosive device or an elaborate prop assembled to look like one, investigators would never conclusively determine. But in that moment, 33,000 feet below cruising altitude, sitting beside a man who showed no sign of fear or hesitation, Florence Schaffner believed it was real. She believed it completely. He closed the briefcase. "I don't want to hurt anyone," he said. "This doesn't have to be difficult." He handed her a second note. This one was more detailed, more operational. It contained his demands, written out clearly, as if by someone who had thought them through many times before and had trimmed them down to the essential points. $200,000 in negotiable $20 bills, 4 parachutes, 2 primary, 2 reserve, a refueling truck ready and waiting in Seattle, a meal for the crew upon landing, and then the plane would take off again. Florence took the note to the cockpit. Captain William Scott read the demands once. Then he radioed Seattle. There was a particular kind of silence that descended on the flight deck in the minutes that followed. Not panic, not chaos, but a focused, professional calm that comes from training for the worst and suddenly living it. Scott kept the aircraft level and on course. He told his crew what was happening. He did not tell the passengers. 36 people sat in the cabin behind him, reading magazines, watching windows, finishing their drinks, unaware that the man in seat 18E had just handed the federal government a problem it had never faced in quite this form before.
The FBI was notified. The Seattle field office mobilized. Northwest Orient executives were reached at home. The airline's president, Donald Narration, made the call quickly. Pay the ransom. No negotiating. The safety of the passengers came first. By the time Flight 305 began its descent into Seattle-Tacoma International, the money was being counted and bundled in a Seattle bank. The serial numbers of every bill were photographed. The FBI wanted a record of every single 20 in that bag, and they got it. 10,000 bills, totaling exactly $200,000, packed into a knapsack. The 4 parachutes were gathered from a local skydiving school, 2 military-grade primary chutes, 2 reserves, including one that it would later turn out was a dummy training chute, sewn shut, non-functional. Whether this was intentional on the FBI's part or simply a logistical accident in a frantic few hours is a question that has never been fully answered. The plane landed. Cooper allowed the passengers to deplane. All 36 walked off into the rainy Seattle night, not one of them knowing how close they had been sitting to a man with a briefcase full of something that might have ended all of them. The crew remained. The money was delivered. The parachutes were brought aboard. Cooper inspected both, methodically, taking his time. He checked the harnesses. He tested the release mechanisms. He did not rush. The agents outside expected him to make a mistake somewhere in here. People under pressure make mistakes. They get greedy or nervous, or they talk too much. They reach for something they shouldn't. They hesitate at the wrong moment. Cooper did none of those things. He asked for the plane to be refueled. He ate his meal. He waited. When everything was exactly as he had specified, he told the crew to take off. Destination, Mexico City, via Reno. The aircraft climbed back into the sky at 7:40 in the evening. The rain had not let up. Cloud cover was dense, and the night beyond the cabin windows was absolute. No city lights, no horizon, nothing but blackness pressing against the glass and the distant strobe of the aircraft's own navigational lights bouncing off the clouds. Inside, the atmosphere had shifted. The hijacking was still ongoing, but the visible threat had changed. Cooper had the money. He had the parachutes. He was no longer making demands because there was nothing left to demand. He sat in the rear of the plane with the knapsack on the seat beside him and said very little. He poured another bourbon. He looked out the window. Flight attendant Tina Mucklow stayed near him, as he had requested. She later said he seemed almost relaxed, not the relief of someone who has gotten what they wanted, but something older and quieter than that. She said he seemed to feel bad for her, that he was apologetic in the way of someone who is sorry for the inconvenience, but not for the act itself.
He studied the maps he had requested, aeronautical charts, detailed topographic maps of the Pacific Northwest. He held them under the reading light and traced routes with one finger, checking distances, checking altitudes, checking terrain. Tina watched him and thought that this man had done a great deal of thinking before he ever bought that ticket. Was he military? He knew how to read aeronautical charts. He knew what questions to ask about the plane's speed and altitude limits. He had asked the crew to keep the aircraft at 10,000 feet with the landing gear extended, understanding exactly how much that would slow them down and why. Was he a pilot? The requests he made showed familiarity with aircraft systems that civilians simply don't have.
Was he a career criminal who had studied all of this from the outside, someone who spent months in libraries and airfields preparing every detail? Nobody knew. Nobody knows. He finished his bourbon. He tied one of the reserve parachutes around the knapsack of money, fashioning a kind of crude harness. He put on the primary parachute. Then, without any announcement, without alerting the crew, he walked to the rear of the aircraft and opened the aft air stair door. The rear staircase of a 727 was one of the aircraft's most unusual features, a set of steps that descended from the tail section, used primarily for boarding at smaller airports that didn't have jetways. It could be operated in flight. Boeing had designed it that way. No one had ever used it the way Cooper was about to. The crew felt it when the door opened, a sudden shift in cabin pressure, a cold rushing sound from the rear of the plane, like the sky itself had torn open. Tina Mucklow was asked, at some point in those final minutes, if Cooper needed anything, if there was anything else she could do for him. He told her to go up front and stay there. The last time anyone saw him was standing at the back of the plane, in the dark, in the rain, at somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 feet, with a knapsack full of money and 2 parachutes, looking down at the black forests of southern Washington. Then the pressure changed. The aircraft shuddered, not from turbulence, but from the disruption of something exiting through the open staircase at 200 miles per hour into 30-degree air and solid driving rain. Captain Scott felt it in the controls. He radioed back. No response from the cabin. The crew went to check. The staircase was empty. Dan Cooper was gone. $200,000 was gone with him. Nobody saw him jump. Nobody tracked him on radar. No one on the ground reported hearing a parachute deployment or seeing a flare or finding a body. The storm was too thick and the terrain below too dark and too dense. He simply ceased to exist.
The FBI had a name, Dan Cooper, and nothing else. Within days, the case had been assigned the designation NORJAC, short for Northwest Hijacking, and it would become the longest-running active investigation in the Bureau's history. Agents were assigned full-time. Field offices in Seattle, Portland, and beyond were mobilized. The task force would eventually review more than 1,000 suspects over nearly 50 years. The sketch distributed to the public showed a man in his mid to late 40s, dark hair, dark eyes, narrow jaw, olive complexion. The kind of face that is generic enough to fit 10,000 men in any American city. Witnesses described him as polite, well-spoken, patient, composed. One flight attendant said he reminded her of someone who worked in sales or middle management, the kind of man you might sit next to at a convention dinner and forget by morning. Tips flooded in by the thousands. Brothers turned in brothers, ex-wives called the tip line, former employees named bosses who had disappeared. Veterans reported fellow soldiers with parachute training and a grudge against the world. Every lead was followed. Every tip was checked. Records were pulled from military archives, prison files, hospital admissions. Former skydivers were interviewed. Flight instructors were interviewed. Retired military parachutists were interviewed. Every time investigators thought they had a credible candidate, something didn't fit. The suspect who matched the physical description couldn't account for his whereabouts that night, but he also had no history of criminal behavior, no knowledge of aeronautics, and was 60 pounds heavier than the man on the plane. The former Green Beret with the right build and the right training had a solid alibi and 3 witnesses to confirm it. The ex-con who had once hijacked a Greyhound bus and demanded $5,000 bore a passing resemblance to the sketch, but had never operated an aircraft, never jumped from anything higher than a rooftop, and had been seen in Las Vegas the night of the hijacking. Every answer generated 2 new questions. The FBI kept working. Then, in the winter of 1980, something happened that no investigator on the task force had predicted. A boy named Brian Ingram was 8 years old that February.
His family was camping along the north bank of the Columbia River, near a place called Tena Bar, a few miles east of Vancouver, Washington. Brian was doing what 8-year-olds at riverbanks do, digging in the sand, turning over rocks, looking for things. He found things. 3 packets of $20 bills, partially decomposed, bound with rubber bands that had mostly crumbled. The paper was deteriorated, eaten at the edges by years of moisture and sediment, but the printing was still legible, and the serial numbers, checked against the FBI's painstaking photographic record from the Seattle bank, were unambiguous. The money belonged to D.B. Cooper. That was what the press had been calling the hijacker for years by then, D.B. Cooper, a name born from a clerical error in an early Wire report that confused Dan Cooper with a different man, a D.B. Cooper who had no connection to the case. The name stuck anyway, the way wrong names sometimes do.
Of the original $200,000, Brian Ingram had found approximately $5,800 worth of bills. The FBI descended on Tena Bar. Investigators sifted through sand and sediment for weeks. They found nothing else, which raised questions that had no clean answers. If Cooper had survived the jump and walked away, why would any of the money be in the river? He had gone to great lengths to carry it out of that plane. It made no sense that a man careful enough to plan every detail of the hijacking would carelessly lose part of his ransom in a river. But if Cooper had died in the jump, if the storm or the terrain or the sheer violence of exiting an aircraft at 200 miles per hour in the dark had killed him, then why had only a fraction of the money surfaced miles from any reasonable landing zone? And why had his body never been found? The Columbia River runs long and runs cold. Bodies do sometimes disappear into it. But the surrounding terrain had been searched repeatedly, and nothing had ever been recovered. Not a harness, not a jumpsuit, not a single bone. The discovery of the money should have been a breakthrough. It became instead a deeper mystery. In the years after the Tena Bar discovery, theorists and investigators and obsessive amateur sleuths developed a dozen competing explanations for what had happened to D.B. Cooper. Each one internally consistent, each one impossible to prove. The most common theory, and the one many FBI agents quietly held, was that he died in the jump. The conditions that night were brutal. 30-degree air, heavy rain, wind shear. He was jumping blind, at night, over some of the most unforgiving terrain in the continental United States. Dense old-growth forest, ravines, rivers, and rocky ridgelines that could break a landing under perfect conditions. He had no jump master. He had no drop zone. He had no communication on the ground. He had not told anyone where he was going, because he was going somewhere no one else knew about. If he died alone in the dark, somewhere in the Cascade foothills or the Lewis River drainage in southwest Washington. And 50 years of weather and wildlife had erased whatever remained. But there were people who could not accept that theory. Not because they were romantics, necessarily, but because the evidence refused to cooperate. If he died near where he jumped, which FBI analysts estimated was somewhere over the Washougal River drainage in southwest Washington, then how did the money end up in the Columbia River near Tena Bar, miles away and in the opposite direction from the likely drop zone? River hydraulics could have carried bills downstream over time, but the bills were buried in a particular kind of layered sediment that some analysts believed had formed around them over many years, not deposited by a single flood event. Which suggested a second possibility.
That Cooper had survived, that he had made it to the ground, discarded or lost part of the money somewhere along the Columbia, and walked away into whatever life he had been preparing to disappear into. Maybe he had an identity waiting, a name he had spent months building, a new social security card, a new driver's license, a rented room in a city where nobody knew his face. Maybe he had an accomplice,
someone who drove out to a prearranged rendezvous point on a forest road and waited with a change of clothes and a tank of gas. The FBI explored this possibility extensively. They looked at men who had disappeared from their lives around the time of the hijacking. Men who had financial troubles, criminal histories, parachute training, and a reason to want to start over. They found dozens of candidates. None of them produced evidence strong enough to close the case. A third theory, quieter and harder to shake, held that the money in the river told the real story, that Cooper had survived the jump but had not survived long afterward, that he had been injured on landing, badly enough that he couldn't move, that he had lain in the forest through the night and the cold and the rain, and that he had not gotten up again, that the money had washed or been carried into a tributary of the Columbia over the years, while his body, deeper in the wilderness, had simply never been found. That would explain why no one ever spent the bills. No marked 20 from Cooper's ransom has ever turned up in circulation. Not one. Nearly 50 years later, not a single bill has been traced to a store, a gas station, a casino, or a bank anywhere in the world. If he survived and spent even a small amount, somewhere in the global banking system, a flagged serial number would have surfaced. Nothing. The FBI officially suspended active investigation of the Hijacked case in July 2016. After 45 years, agents closed the working files. The physical evidence, the tie Cooper left behind, the cigarette butts, the partial DNA samples gathered over decades of renewed effort were archived. The task force was dissolved. The Bureau released a brief public statement acknowledging that despite the longest sustained investigation in the organization's history, the case remained unsolved. The statement was 3 paragraphs long. It did not name a suspect. It did not offer a theory. It acknowledged only that the investigation had exhausted its viable leads, and that the resources required to continue active pursuit could no longer be justified. For the agents who had spent parts of their careers on the case, who had chased down dead ends in suburban Portland and followed leads to trailer parks in rural Nevada, and interviewed old men in nursing homes who might or might not have once gone by the name Dan Cooper, the closure of the investigation was not triumphant.
It was more like the feeling of setting down something heavy you've been carrying so long that you barely notice the weight anymore. The man on the plane was never identified. His real name was never spoken in any court, any official record, any confirmed document. He remains, in the legal and historical sense, a complete unknown. Somewhere in the United States, or possibly no longer in the United States, or possibly no longer in the world at all, there may be a very old man who knows the answer to all of this. He might be in his 80s or 90s by now, if he is alive at all. He might be a grandfather. He might have spent 50 years watching the news coverage with a private, careful attention, noting every development, every new suspect, every new theory, making sure his name was never among them. He might have driven past Tina Bar once, out of something that wasn't quite guilt, just to see the river that had given so much away. Or he might have died in the dark on a November night in 1971 somewhere in the forests of southwest Washington, with $200,000 beside him and no one coming to find him. Maybe both versions of that man are partly true. Maybe neither. That's the thing about this case. That's why it has outlasted the investigators assigned to it, the era that produced it, even the airline the man flew on. Northwest Orient no longer exists. The 727 he hijacked was retired from service years ago. The agents who first worked Norjack are mostly gone now. The air traffic controllers who brought him bourbon and handed him his parachutes have aged into their late years, and some of them have died carrying the memory of his face. And still, nobody knows. Not who he was, not where he went, not whether the earth took him or he walked away from it. On a cold November night in 1971, a man walked into a small airport with a briefcase and a ticket he paid for in cash. He boarded a plane. He gave his name as Dan Cooper. And then, somewhere over the dark forests of the Pacific Northwest, in the rain and the cold and the absolute black of a storm-covered sky, he stepped off the edge of a staircase and fell into history. Whether he hit the ground running or just hit the ground is a question that may never be answered. And that silence, more than any arrest or revelation or courtroom confession, is what makes him unforgettable. The FBI never found him. 50 years of investigation, thousands of suspects, one unsolved case. And somewhere out there, in an old photograph, a forgotten letter, a face in the background of a family album, the answer might still exist, waiting for someone to find it. That's what keeps me doing this.
If this story got to you the way it got to me, share it with one person. Just one. These cases deserve to be heard. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Every week I cover a new case. The ones that were buried, the ones that were botched, the ones that nobody talks about anymore. You don't want to miss what's coming next. Drop a comment below. Do you think D.B. Cooper survived the jump? I read every single one. See you in the next one.